This talk is somewhat more advanced than my last few. It's on Marxist political economy, but it's on a topic which is not widely understood within Marxist political economy. It's what I call the polarization of capital. The talk is going to cover the laws of motion of finance capital, what determines the rate of interest, and the process of formation of financial crises. The context of this work is research that was done way back in 1977 by a study group looking at the conjunctural crisis of the British economy at the time. It was a group of Marxist economists and activists set up by communist formation, and it aimed to fill in a theory of the rate of interest and the origins of the rentier class. Both these things were missing from standard Marxian economics at the time. It was initially an internal report of the organization we belonged to, and the working group included myself, Alan Cottrell and Greg Michelson, and some others who I won't mention now since they are no longer active as far as I know. A PDF of the original 1997 is available, and it's in a form that I typeset from the original mechanically typed document. I typeset it in 1993 to make it more readable, and it's on academia.edu with the link as shown. What does this research link into? Well, among the concepts are the concept of profit of enterprise, which is a concept Marx introduces in volume 3 of Capital. In the paper, though not so much within this short presentation I'm giving, it relies on Kalecki's aggregate theory of profit. It relies also on the work of the 1950s Marxist Steindl, who did work on the maturity and stagnation of American capitalism, and in particular we drew on his work on the theory of gearing ratios. Our work also prefigures the stochastic or thermodynamic Marxism of Farjun and Makova, which was published about 7 years after this was worked out. We make explicit conceptual borrowing from thermodynamics or statistical mechanics, just as Farjun and Makova do, and it's an analysis of capitalism as governed by laws of particle motion. If you look at the full paper, it more or less gives you forces acting on the particles. Why do we need this? In order to have a theory of crises, you need a theory of investment. And in order to have a theory of investment, you need a theory of interest rates. And if one wants to understand the history of British capitalism during the 20th century, you needed to understand why financial policy was so dominated in many circumstances by the rentier interest, particularly in the period between the two world wars. And again, it has come to be dominated by the rentier interest in the early 21st century. And in order to understand that, you have to know how a rentier class arises in the first place. One of the problems is that there is no Marxian theory of the rate of interest. There's no Marxian theory of the rate of interest in capital. In this paper, we introduced a theory of the rate of interest, and I'll present it here. The basic hypothesis we have is that the interest rate is determined by the ratio between the mass of bank deposits and the reserves that these banks have of state money which can be used to meet withdrawals from these deposits. And it can be deduced on purely actuarial grounds, assuming daily withdrawals are a random variable. It's a very simple stochastic theory of the rate of interest. Well, it's a stochastic theory. Whether it's simple is another matter. We start off with the daily bank failure probability function. Now we know the probability of banks failing is actually quite low. It does happen, but there is a low probability of it. If we look at this diagram, we see probability is on the vertical axis. Along the x-axis is the quantity of deposits banks have. This variable Q, this function QW, is the expected the probable level of reserve. Oh, sorry, the probable level of withdrawals. It shows, strictly speaking, it is the probability that withdrawals will exceed W. Now, these are daily withdrawals. Now, if the quantity W is very small, it's quite likely that withdrawals will exceed W. But as W gets greater, the probability that withdrawals will be more than that falls lower and lower and lower. And by the time you reach the total number of total deposits Q, it's practically zero. Now, at any one time, a bank only actually has a certain quantity of money that it has available to meet these withdrawals, its reserves, which I'm showing by M here. And the probability that a bank will run out of money is given by the area of this curve to the right of M. And we know that's going to be small, because banks rarely actually run out of money. But they may run short of money without actually failing. The last time a bank failed in Britain was about 10 years ago, when the Northern Rock Bank failed. And one day, more people were trying to pull money out than the available reserves. The bank failed and had to be rescued. However, before they normally reach that stage, they'll start borrowing from other banks to try and meet their obligations. If it's forced to borrow to meet its obligations, if Northern Rock was forced to borrow to meet its obligations, it has to take out a loan from another bank and pay interest on that. Now, once you accept that, you can calculate the probable cost to a bank of making a loan. On the one hand, if it makes a loan L, on the one hand it has to pay interest on the deposits which it normally held for that. It's assuming it's making a loan from ordinary depositors' money. On the other hand, there is the probability that making that loan will cause it to run its reserves down to the point where it has to start borrowing to remain liquid. And that is the second part is given by this term here, where R is the rate of interest it'll have to pay other banks if it has to borrow from them. And therefore we can say that the rate of interest that the bank will charge industrial borrowers, which we'll indicate by R prime, must be greater than the rate of interest on deposits plus the rate of interest on borrowings to other banks times the probability function at that point, probability function Q at that point. Okay, now that actually gives us a formula for the rate of interest, and we've run simulations of this, and we've built models of the capitalist economy, which we ran through simulation models shortly before the 2008 crisis, actually, at the 25th anniversary conference of Farjun and Makover's book coming out. We deduce the rate of interest is determined by the ratio of reserves to deposits. Now, given that the reserves, M, are which is state money, and money that's issued outside the private banking system by the state, what determines the mass of deposits? Because it's given M, it's the mass of deposits that will give the weighting of the function Q, and therefore the probability that the individual banks will have to borrow from other banks and therefore meet a higher cost for making loans. So the next thing is to analyze what governs the growth of deposits in a banking system. Now, the following basic relationships must hold. The growth in deposits plus bank profits must be the growth in loans plus the growth of monetary reserves. Now, if we assume that all of banks' profits are distributed, i.e. they're transferred to the accounts of the rentiers who are the nominal owners of the bank capital, and that the total reserves are fixed by the action of the state, then the growth in bank deposits is going to be made up of two components: the growth in rentiers' deposits and the growth in enterprise deposits, i.e. the growth in deposits by the rentiers who just leave their money in the bank, and the growth in deposits by firms. Now this makes the enterprise deposits the free variable, because the growth in rentiers' deposits is just equivalent to the savings of the rentier class. But enterprises are more complicated. Some firms are borrowers and some firms are lenders. In what follows, we will divide them into four categories. Borrowers, and this assumes they are already in debt and are borrowing further. Ones that are in debt but repaying their loans. Those that have net positive deposits and are building up the deposits, and those who have positive deposits but are running them down. So those are the four possible conditions that enterprises can be in. I'm now going to introduce a concept from physics which is called a phase plane diagram. Phase plane diagrams are a technique borrowed from dynamical systems, in particular the theory of gas molecules. Just as Farjun and Makover did, we viewed the set of all enterprises as a gas, but we looked at how this gas was distributed in the phase plane and attempted to analyze its dynamics. In classical dynamics, we normally have a position and a momentum for every particle, or a position and a velocity. And the axes of our phase plane diagrams will be, for example, position axis or a momentum axis. And what I'm going to do in what follows is develop monetary analogues for position and momentum. In order to do this, I define the enterprise phase space axes, which are I call J and G. First, I introduce the variable E, which is Marx's rate of profit of enterprise. Now, the profit of enterprise is the profit after paying interest. It's the profit that a firm has after it's paid interest on its loans. And K is the capital stock. So E will typically be less than the total rate of profit. Now, alpha is the rate of investment as a function of capital stock. Sorry, rate of investment as a portion of capital stock. And J, which is going to be one of my axes, is alpha minus E. Now, that is investment taking away the rate of profit of enterprise. So if the rate of profit of enterprise is greater than alpha, a firm will have a negative J. That is to say, it will not be building up debts. If, on the other hand, it is accumulating faster than its rate of a profit of enterprise, it has to borrow to meet it. So J is a variable which denotes velocity in debt space. And the other variable we take is one we take from Steindl, which is G, the gearing ratio, which is the ratio of a firm's debt to its capital stock. So here's the enterprise phase plane, and the four groups of categories of firms that I mentioned earlier are shown here. In quadrant 1, we have the firms that are carrying out borrowing. Now they have firms with a positive J, and J is velocity in debt space, so it means they're building up debt. And G shows their total current debt. This is a standard feature of a phase plane diagram. One is velocity, one is position. Quadrant 2 are firms that are repaying their loans. They have positive debt, i.e. their gearing ratio is above 0, but their J is negative, which means they're repaying their loans. Firms down here have negative G and negative J. That is to say, a negative gearing ratio means that their deposits with the banks exceed their borrowing from the banks. So these firms are net creditors and they're accumulating deposits. Firms here are net creditors who are running down their deposits. I'm treating enterprise as gas molecules in this phase space. Now, something we can deduce is the center of gravity of the entire mass of these gas molecules. And the center of gravity is shown as J bar and G bar. And we assume a probability density function, which gives the probability of an enterprise being at position J and G. As I said, we have done numerical simulations showing the evolution of the enterprise gas in this phase space. The original paper gives analytic solutions to the dynamics of the system. Now, what are the dynamics of the enterprise gas? The distribution of the enterprise population across the phase plane is what determines the growth of bank deposits. And this is, in bourgeois economics, seen as what determines the growth. It determines what is called the money supply in bourgeois economics. But the term money supply is misleading. What it actually shows is the amount of deposits held by the banking system. And basically it's determined by how much of the bank population is in quadrant 3 here. I've said quadrant 4 there, that's a mistake. That should be 3. Let me just correct that. And this distribution tends to be unstable. And that's the critical thing from the point of view of understanding how a rentier class arises and how financial crises arise. There exists a set of positions where the gearing ratio is stable. And for enterprises whose gearing ratio is stable, you can show that it are those enterprises with an equilibrium gearing ratio given by J over alpha. And these actually fall along a straight line here in this phase space. If firms move too far along here, the gearing ratio, the equilibrium gearing ratio is above 1, and therefore they would be bankrupt. So this is the zone of bankruptcy. Ones over here, on the other hand, are equilibrium net creditors. And therefore there is a limit set in this quadrant, but there's no limit set in the quadrant number 3. Firms can move down into this quadrant as far as they like, building up surplus deposits. Firms which build up surplus debts, taking them above gearing ratio 1, become bankrupt because their liabilities exceed their assets and they're insolvent. In general, capitals with a profit rate P greater than the rate of interest will have a positive equilibrium gearing ratio. And capital, that is to say, it pays for them to borrow money to expand, because they will make more profit on that than the interest they have to pay. Capitals with a rate of profit below the rate of interest and low initial gearing ratios become net creditors by accumulating bank deposits. Capitals with a rate of profit below R and high gearing ratios move over to bankruptcy. The equilibrium point is on the y-axis of the phase diagram, which is unstable. Capitals to the left of the y-axis move down and to the left. Capitals to the right of it move up and to the right towards bankruptcy. Simulations show that if you start off with a population of capitals like this, it develops into a tadpole shape with a rentier tail growing down into this area. But because the total mass of deposits and the total assets and liabilities of the banking system must balance, and since we have the centre of gravity given by the external savings of the rentier class, relative to the centre of gravity, any movement down here must generate an equal and opposite movement in this direction. So you get an inherent polarization process because of the conservation laws governing accounting of money in the banking system. There is a deep relationship between conservation laws and monetary phenomena. In physics, we have conservation laws which determine the dynamical properties of systems, and in the financial system, the actual practices of the banks and of accounting introduce conservation laws. Now, if the rate of interest rises, what happens is it tends to disperse the firms along the pseudo-rentier and bankrupt polarization axis. That in turn accelerates the growth of bank deposits Q. This results in further rises in the rate of interest, which accentuates the process and precipitates a crisis. And that's what happened in 2008. Incidentally, the fact that it hit the Northern Rock first is an interesting property of the law of large numbers. The variance of a sample depends on the size of the sample. Now, the Northern Rock was in an unusual position in that a large part of its deposits were coming from other banks rather than small depositors. Now, a probability distribution over a small sample will tend to have a larger variance, and therefore the Northern Rock was a bank whose Q function had a long tail to the right compared to other banks, and it was therefore the one most likely to fail. This process of polarization means that given an initial population of capitals, whether they're individuals or firms, that population will polarize into rentiers and productive capitals. And this is a necessary consequence of the dispersion of profit rates between capitals and the existence of an interest rate. It's important not to use the concept of a money supply. Money is not a supplied commodity. It's a system of records. It's an information structure that records the entropy of the enterprise gas in phase space. Rises in interest rates that are intended to curtail the growth of the money supply have the perverse short-term effect of increasing Q, the mass of bank deposits. This was very evident in the measures that Geoffrey Howe took in the early 1980s. Raised interest with the intention of curtailing the growth of the money supply, but what actually happened is that QE, the mass of deposits, increased. So, what have we covered? We've covered a econophysics type theory of financial crises, the rate of interest, and the dynamical motion of firms in a phase space. I know this is a relatively complex and sophisticated piece of Marxian political economy compared to my previous talks, so I expect the number of people who will be interested in it to be smaller, but financial crises are a critical factor in the development of capitalism. They occur periodically, and to understand them, you actually need to know the laws of motion of finance capital, not simply the laws of motion of industrial capital. Thank you.